Well, thank you all for having me come up and speak a little bit about Minnesotans at Chickamauga. And I'm glad that you all are conducting this series of symposiums and seminars in recognition of the 150th anniversary of our nation's tragic and transformative Civil War. And I'm so glad to see such a crowd of folks out. And I hope that the handouts were sufficient in number. There are a few more, so if there are a couple of folks who did not get them, you can identify yourself and somebody can get one around to you. Good, it looks like everybody has gotten them. I brought the current brochure for Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park with me, and it today is more just an advertisement, hoping to encourage you to come and visit this ground hallowed in part by Minnesotans now almost 150 years ago. Mostly we're going to make use of the paper handout that I provided you, and those same graphics or a version of them will appear in the PowerPoint as well. But I know from attending many programs myself that oftentimes, regardless of how good the PowerPoint is, it's good to have something in your hand to look at and study and consider things. So hopefully we'll work through that. Out on the table in the lobby, I also put two other things. One is a card that briefly summarizes what is being done at Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park this year to recognize the 150th anniversary of the campaign for Chattanooga and the battles of Chickamauga and Chattanooga. This card was produced last year when the programs were still being developed and refined, so there is not a tremendous amount of detail on this card. However, as almost literally every day goes by, more details of these programs are appearing on the National Military Park's website. And so I would encourage you, if you are thinking about heading that way, to take a look at the website on a regular basis and start to see the greater details of these programs as they are announced. And then finally, as part of the National Military Park's ongoing maintenance and preservation of the battlefield, we are continuing our program of trying to restore, repair some of the monuments on the battlefield. And the Twin Cities Civil War Roundtable a few years ago helped in an important way in this project by providing both information and funds to help recast long missing Minnesota state seals from several of the Minnesota monuments on the battlefield. One of the big projects that's underway right now is to restore the monument to Union Brigade Commander William Haynes Lytle, who was killed at Chickamauga on September 20th, 1863, often recognized as the poet general for the poem Antony and Cleopatra he had written just before the Civil War. His shell pyramid that marked the spot where he fell was damaged long ago, and now for several generations has been only a single layer of cannonballs. But after many years, your United States government is once again ordering 8-inch naval shells, and will soon begin erecting them in the form of a 3-sided 15-high pyramid, so that by September, Lytle, on the 150th anniversary of his death, will have the same shell pyramid as the other 7 brigade commanders do on the battlefield. Out on a table in the lobby is a flyer about this partnership effort involving both the Friends of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park and several other organizations, including the Lytle Camp of the Sons of Union Veterans in Cincinnati. And so if you're interested in that, you can certainly take one of those flyers and consider contributing. You can buy an 8-inch or provide money that will help buy an 8-inch naval shell to make that reconstruction possible. The Friends are still just a little bit short of the funds that are necessary. Of course, as we heard in the introduction, this campaign for Chattanooga, of which the Battle of Chickamauga is a part, is one of the more important campaigns of not only the events of 1863, but also of the Civil War as a whole. In your handout, if you look at map number 1, where you will find Chattanooga near the center of that page. Of course, Chattanooga, this is another version of it, but there Chattanooga you'll find on even the one that you have right there near the center of the page. Chattanooga is, of course, important because it is the doorway, gateway, passageway to the Deep South. It is widely recognized and easily recognized as that railroad transportation center, which would have been important even if, indeed, the Civil War had been a short war as everyone had expected in 1861. It would have been important at that time with the expectation of the 1 or 2 battles of the war being fought in northern Virginia, or even after that first summer where it was clear that the war would be a little bit longer. It would have been important even when, when the Confederates were attempting to develop a general defensive line across this area, the dotted line that you find on the maps. But Chattanooga's importance increased as that initial defensive line collapsed. Not only do you have the development of the Union blockade that we heard a little bit about, but also in early 1862, the Union Army will mount a series of drives southward that will penetrate that initial defensive line along the Mississippi River and in western Tennessee, of course, most famously with the battles of Fort Henry, Hindman, and Donelson. And for residents in the valley of the Mississippi, the thrust southward down the Mississippi River to reopen that vital corridor. But Chattanooga's importance continues to grow as in central Georgia and central Alabama, the Confederate States of America begins to develop what we in the 20th and now 21st century would think of as a military-industrial complex. You heard earlier that indeed the Confederates will be challenged in providing the necessary war materiel for their bid for independence. However, in central Georgia and central Alabama, they are developing the industry to produce much of that war materiel. And by 1863, that complex is producing most of that needed war materiel, even if it is not always of the best quality. And as a result of that advancement for the Confederacy, Chattanooga becomes even more important as the Union authorities recognize that that growing military-industrial complex must be destroyed and disrupted. And how do you get a Union Army from the north to central Georgia and central Alabama? Because you have to supply that army. It's going to be to come down the line of railroads from Louisville to Nashville to Chattanooga. The campaign for Chattanooga in 1863, which, and as the version of the map that you have, is further summarized with the Union success of gaining Chattanooga in 1863, therefore allowing in 1864 who to do what to Georgia? William Tecumseh Sherman to march from Chattanooga to Atlanta and from Atlanta to the Atlantic coast at Savannah. And as Sherman marched across Georgia in 1864, what did he do to that ever-growing military-industrial complex in central Georgia and central Alabama? Disrupt it or destroyed it. So this campaign for Chattanooga becomes one of the most critical, most important, and it is that campaign which unfolds beginning in the summer of 1863, first with that Tullahoma phase in late June and early July, and then with the more direct advance on Chattanooga beginning in mid-August. And in fact, if you were a member of the 2nd Minnesota, in those late summer days of 1863. And in particular on the evening of September the 17th, as the regiment and brigade formed into line of battle at each halt during that day's march, and as columns of dust were observed rising across West Chickamauga Creek, paralleling your own march northeastward, and that late afternoon you had countermarched with rapid and long strides, as one of the 2nd Minnesotans would relate, back along your march of the day to deal with an enemy cavalry probe that had thrust across West Chickamauga Creek and into the general Union line of advance. And in the end, having done little damage except to the sutlers of 2 of the regiments in your brigade, but not your regimental sutler. He had been smart enough to pack up and move earlier in the day. And then that night, bivouacking on your arms in a position where, as you looked eastward, you could view Confederate campfires from the movement of Confederate troops that same day and afternoon. All of these were indicators, clear indicators, that the marching and maneuvering of the last month over the mountains, rivers, and more mountains had brought you and the other forces of the Army of the Cumberland and to the eve of the long-expected clash or battle for control of the Chattanooga region. For any member of Colonel James George's 2nd Minnesota that evening who was in a retrospective mood that then looked back over that last month of activity, they would have noted that it had been quite a month. You can now advance to the second map in your handout. And here's one of the dangers of trying to move into the electronic world. This handout, this graphic, is wrong. I had trouble getting this thing produced, and in the end, wouldn't you know, the one that gets sent to the photocopier is one of the wrong ones. The error on this map is, wrong graph. There we go. The error on this map is that you'll notice right here and right here the words 2nd Minnesota Light Artillery. That should have said Van Cleve, noting where Minneapolis resident Horatio Van Cleve was operating, and the 2nd Minnesota Light Artillery should be on this arrow and this arrow. However, as I said, the version, or the one that actually got sent to the printer to print, is this one where I was struggling to get it produced correctly. So I apologize for that. So if you make that pen and ink change, you'll be able to compensate. So
I was just going to comment. If you read Shelby Foote before he died, he said that if he rewrote his 3 volumes, they would all be different. So just wait a few years, this might change again.
Well, let's hope not. I have actually been slow in moving into the digital age, in part because, as was noted, I do a lot of staff rides for the military, what might generically be known as a battle analysis. And if anyone has served in the United States military, particularly the Army, in the last 10 to 20 years, you know that that PowerPoint has just about been successful in conquering the United States Army. Military officers are inflicted with one bad PowerPoint after another. And I learned very early on, as PowerPoint began to appear, that if a group of military officers arrived for a staff ride and walked into the room where I do the introductory strategic and operational level briefing, and I have a laptop and a PowerPoint projector set up, their eyes glaze over instantly, and I've lost them from the very beginning. And so I have stayed extremely low-tech, paper handouts, which I'm now trying to convert to electronic for things like this, and also a 14 by 16 foot canvas map that or map that I've drawn out on a large piece of canvas. I take my boots off and I walk around on top of it pushing colored markers. And they utterly appreciate the low-tech version of the effort. So I am still struggling with this electronic thing, and I can't get my 17-year-old to help me. So, but on this one graphic, I try to relate the general course of the campaign in those late summer days of 1863. As we heard very briefly, initially Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland had advanced from Murfreesboro off the upper left-hand corner of the map and had been successful in late June and early July in operating against Braxton Bragg's army in the greater Tullahoma region, forcing Bragg to withdraw on the city of Chattanooga, where Confederate General Braxton Bragg had deployed his troops along the Tennessee River, flowing southwestward across the map. William Stark Rosecrans, at that time, with about 70,000 soldiers he can take into the field, having an advantage of roughly 3 soldiers to 2. Rosecrans recognized that a direct advance from the Tullahoma region towards Chattanooga was not going to be practical, given the mountainous terrain and the Tennessee River in between. And therefore, William Stark Rosecrans had devised this multi-column, broad front advance on the Chattanooga area, identifying correctly that the Western and Atlantic Railroad, leading south from Chattanooga 120 miles to Atlanta, was Braxton Bragg's main line of communications, main line of supply. William Stark Rosecrans decided to advance 2 columns southwestward over the mountains to the west and southwest of Chattanooga, with the intention of threatening the railroad somewhere in North Georgia, well south of Chattanooga. But of course, wanting to make this as his main thrust, but not wanting the Confederates to contest that move, Rosecrans incorporated a feint or deception movement into his plan. A full 1/3 of his army, with attachments, including the division of Horatio Van Cleve, advanced out of Middle Tennessee, over the Cumberland Mountains, and into the Sequatchie River Valley. There, elements of that force were sent over the Walden's Ridge Range and down to the banks of the Tennessee River upstream of Chattanooga. These troops were to create the impression of a major Union threat coming in from the northwest and north of Chattanooga. And they were successful in making that impression on Braxton Bragg. As a result of the dragging of brush on the dry, dusty roads, stirring up clouds of dust to make it appear as if large numbers of troops are moving, the maintenance of large numbers of campfires at night behind hills leading down to the banks of the Tennessee River, the banging on barrels and boxes to create the sound of seemingly construction of rafts, boats, and bridges to cross the Tennessee River upstream of Chattanooga. Braxton Bragg, in the last days of August and the first days of September, had moved the bulk of his army from right at Chattanooga to points upstream or to the north-northeast of Chattanooga, leaving the area to the west even more open. At the same time that the deception was unfolding, the other elements of Rosecrans' army, the other 2/3, advanced down to the banks of the Tennessee River, near Stevenson, Alabama at Caperton's Ferry, this column including the 2nd Minnesota Light Artillery, and John Brannan's division climbed over the Cumberland Mountains. The men of the 2nd Minnesota in that division taking in the site of the just begun University of the South, the Episcopal University, that now Confederate General Leonidas Polk had founded on the top of the mountain. They reveled in the sign of destruction, where some other Union troops had joyously disassembled the grand ceremonial cornerstone of the university rather explosively. And they had then marched off of the top of the Cumberland Mountains, down the Sweden's Cove and Battle Creek Cove, and down to the banks of the Tennessee River at the mouth of Battle Creek. There, as they looked across, they had observed at first Confederates looking back at them over the roughly 600-yard wide Tennessee River at that point. And other Union columns advanced down to the river at Bridgeport and also at Shell Mound, both up and downstream of Battle Creek. There, as Rosecrans came to realize how sparsely covered the crossings of the Tennessee River were to the west and southwest of Chattanooga, Rosecrans ordered 4 crossings of the Tennessee. But the Army had only provided him with enough pontoons for 1.8 bridges over the Tennessee River. And so there was the need to devise other means of crossing. And this is an advantage of citizen soldiers. Of today, we might think of them as the National Guard and Reserve, because as the desire to cross the river at multiple points was considered, there was also the recognition that there was the potential skill to do this in the ranks of the soldiers. As John Brannan's division was told to look at crossing the river near Battle Creek, Ferdinand Vanderveer, the commander of the 3rd Brigade of that division, knowing the makeup of one of his regiments, the 2nd Minnesota, knew that within that regiment was a company of men from the St. Croix River region, Company F. And what was one of the big industries or parts of the economy of that region at the time? Lumber, timber. And how were saw logs gotten to the sawmill? They were floated down the river, rafted together. And there were amongst the members of that company men experienced in rafting logs together. But where are they going to get the material to build the raft? Well, guess who lives right near there? A very noisy Southern sympathizer who resides in a 2-story hewn log house. Why cut trees down when you can simply disassemble the home of one of these rebellious citizens and craft your raft out of that? And they did. And Rosecrans ordered on August 29th and 30th that the Army cross the Tennessee River. And the evening of August the 29th, some men are ferried over the Tennessee River at Battle Creek on a raft constructed by Company F of the 2nd Minnesota. In fact, in the end, almost all of Brannan's division will cross there, even some of the wagons, although most of the wheeled vehicles will go down, the wagons will go down to Bridgeport and cross there on the 8/10 of a pontoon bridge that is constructed there. Once across at Shell Mound, Battle Creek, Bridgeport, and Stevenson, Rosecrans will consolidate these troops into 2 columns to climb over first the Sand Mountain Range and then the Lookout Mountain Range at intervals of 20 and 40 miles below Chattanooga. The 2nd Minnesota will climb the Sand Mountain Range in the area of Nickajack Cave and the Gordon coal mines, and then will descend the Sand Mountain Range. Each one of these climbs taking the division, Brannan's division, about a day's time to either climb or descend the mountain. The road was only 2 miles in length, but extremely steep, 12 to 14% grades on the roads. It didn't take the men very long to march up the road, but it took long to move the wheeled vehicles, all of the artillery and wagons of each one of those brigade and division columns. But by September the 6th, as Rosecrans' troops begin to climb for the Lookout Mountain Range about 20 airline miles to the southwest of Chattanooga, and McCook's men about 40 miles to the southwest of Chattanooga, Bragg in Chattanooga suddenly realizes that this and not this is the major Union threat. And on September the 6th, Rosecrans' birthday, Bragg made the decision to abandon the city of Chattanooga and march south into Georgia. But Bragg's army has been reinforced. Troops have been sent to it from Mississippi, East Tennessee, and about this same time the decision is being made to put some additional troops on trains to send to Bragg's army. James Longstreet's troops from Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And as Bragg marched south and began to realize the widely scattered elements of the Union Army, he ordered that his march south halt, and he attempted to attack the center column of the Union Army in a pocket on the side of Lookout Mountain called McLemore's Cove. But the command dissension within his army will intervene, and he'll miss the opportunity to strike at the Union Army while it is widely scattered over this mountainous terrain. William Stark Rosecrans will order a consolidation of the columns, will order Alexander McCook's 20th Corps and the 2nd Minnesota Light Artillery to march up from the south, resulting in them having to climb back over the Lookout Mountain range and then move up the valley between Lookout Mountain and Sand Mountain to have to do what? Climb Lookout Mountain again. And then McCook and Thomas will start to reach up to where Rosecrans has moved Crittenden's Corps out after having occupied Chattanooga when the Confederates abandoned it on September the 9th. And during these days, the 2nd Minnesota Light Artillery will retrace their steps over the Lookout Mountain range and then up that valley, only to have to climb the mountain again. The 2nd Minnesota will spend several days stationed in McLemore's Cove, and then they too will begin reaching up to the north-northeast to link up with Crittenden near Lee and Gordon's Mill. And it was on that September the 17th when the men of the 2nd Minnesota began to recognize clearly that there was the likelihood of a clash in the immediate coming days. Observing Confederate or dust from Confederate columns paralleling theirs as they marched northward. On the morning of September the 18th, the likely clash became even more clear. That morning, the column was reduced. The baggage wagons, the quartermaster wagons, the commissary wagons of Brannan's division and Vandevier's brigade in the 2nd Minnesota were all packed up and sent to the rear. Remaining only with the troops as they rested in line of battle were the wagons carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and of course the brigade ambulances. And that afternoon, after observing more signs of Confederate movement to the northeast, orders suddenly came to Brannan's division that they were to get on the road. Having rested during much of the day, they are now ordered to march northeastward. They had only a short distance to go, seemingly. But as now Rosecrans is struggling to move troops up to the northeast, they're going to find the roads clogged. Largely unknown to the men of the 2nd Minnesota was what had been happening during the course of September the 18th. If you now turn to the 3rd page in the handout, the first of the pages that actually have 2 maps on them, and look at the map on the left-hand side of the page. The order to march that evening of September the 18th that came to the 2nd Minnesota and Vandevier's brigade and Brannan's division was a result of Bragg's latest effort to strike at Rosecrans' army before Rosecrans could consolidate the scattered pieces and get that force repositioned to protect newly won and lightly garrisoned Chattanooga. The plan that Braxton Bragg had developed, and which was beginning to become clear to even the men in the ranks, particularly those who could observe the columns of dust moving northward as well, was this. Bragg having identified that the Union Army was positioned with Tom Crittenden's 21st Corps in the area of Lee and Gordon's Mill, and that the rest of the Army was along West Chickamauga Creek at points upstream or south-southwestward of Lee and Gordon's Mill, and that these troops were moving north-northeastward to link up at Lee and Gordon's Mill. Bragg realized that between Crittenden at Lee and Gordon's Mill and Chattanooga, off the top of this map, that there were very few Union troops. And what Bragg envisioned doing was using roughly 3/5 of his now slightly more than 60,000 man force to confront the Federals directly across West Chickamauga Creek at Lee and Gordon's Mill and points upstream to fix the Federals in place, while the other 2/5 of his army, or a force of 25,000 men, advanced from the south, southeast, and east, and attempted to cross Chickamauga Creek at points downstream of Lee and Gordon's Mill, and swing to the west and southward, and strike the Union left flank at Lee and Gordon's Mill, and drive the Union Army southwestward, and crush it against the wall of Lookout Mountain that those Union troops had just climbed over. Bragg's hope was that he could badly damage or destroy the Army of the Cumberland in the process, and then that would allow him to reoccupy Chattanooga with just its small Union garrison. But for Bragg on September the 18th, things did not go well from the very beginning. He had made the decision to postpone his attack from the 17th to the 18th. The movement of the troops on the 17th that afternoon had raised those columns of dust that the 2nd Minnesota men had seen off to their east, and that began to tip Rosecrans and others off to what Bragg was trying to do. Bragg had also changed the orders on how to implement this plan at dawn on September the 18th, and there was a delay caused by the dissemination of those new orders. And then, as the Bragg's 5 columns moved towards their designated crossing points, his staff had messed up and caused a traffic jam. 2 columns of roughly 8,000 and 6,000 men were sent through the same 4-way intersection. What does that do for the speed of movement? And then, as these columns advanced that day, they encountered Federal forces. While Rosecrans had not been able to cover this area fully between himself and Chattanooga, he was aware that the Confederates might try to do exactly this, and small Union forces had been positioned to guard several key crossings, including Reed's Bridge, where there was a clash between Nathan Bedford Forrest and Bushrod Johnson and a small body of Union cavalry under Robert H.G. Minty, and Alexander's Bridge, where John Thomas Wilder's brigade of mounted infantry with the Spencer repeating rifles was in position. The resistance by Minty and Wilder had slowed the delayed Confederate advance, so much so that by the end of the day, Bragg had been unable to actually strike the Union left flank at Lee and Gordon's Mill, Crittenden's men, and this had then allowed Rosecrans a clear picture of what Bragg was trying to do, and that resulted in that late afternoon order to Brannan's division, Baird's division, and within Brannan's division, Ferdinand Vanderveer's brigade and the men of the 2nd Minnesota. And the men that night set out on a march and marched all of 600 yards and then stood. 30 or 45 minutes later, they marched another couple of hundred miles, or excuse me, a couple of hundred yards. They wanted to march all of the distance, so, and then they stood for another time. And then they marched several hundred more yards and stood again, and then marched further and stood again. All night long, they're going to march in this short segment. fashion. Now, some of you all probably served in the infantry at one time or another, and what do infantrymen like to do if they have to make a march? Get it over with. These guys were unable to. Because of all of the troops that Rosecrans had shifting, there were traffic problems in Rosecrans' army that night, and as a result, the men of Baird's division and Brannan's division, including the 2nd Minnesota, are going to wind up marching all night long. And someone along the route decided that to provide some light, and since it was getting cold, some heat, they would set the fences on fire along the side of the road. Now, you've just marched through a road surface that has a fine powdery dust layer on it that is several inches thick. You've stirred all that dust up. Now you're standing, and all the smoke is rising. How comfortable was that march that night? The next morning, just after dawn, troops began arriving along the Lafayette Road on the Kelly Farm, about 3 miles to the north of where Crittenden had been at Lee and was at Lee and Gordon's mill. But while these men had had to endure that all-night march, that will be critical in allowing Rosecrans to counteract or offset what Bragg had done the day before. The men of Brannan's division arrived at the Kelly Farm about 8 o'clock. And as Judson Bishop, the lieutenant colonel of the 2nd Minnesota, would later write, our brigade halted, filed out of the road near the Kelly house, and stacked arms, while the word was passed down the line, 20 minutes for breakfast. In 5 minutes, hundreds of little fires were kindled, and hundreds of little coffee cans were filled with water from the canteens and set to boil. In 10 minutes, boiling coffee was lifted off, the luscious bacon was nicely browned, and ever-toothsome hardtack, I can hear the sarcasm in his writing even now, had been toasted. When comes an aide at a furious gallop down the dusty road, a brief order delivered by him to our brigade commander, and each regiment gets orders to take arms and march immediately. Of course, some urgent and peremptory necessity was supposed. Arms were taken, and we filed out onto the road, now clear, and briskly moved off northward in a choking cloud of dust. While Rosecrans had those troops make that night march and extend the Union left flank closer to Chattanooga, word had come to George Thomas as they had arrived that there might be the possibility of capturing one lone Confederate brigade out near Reed's Bridge and Jay's Steam Sawmill. And as a result, Thomas is going to send Brannan's division out to the east to try to do just that. And it's going to result in the opening action of what becomes the history books Battle of Chickamauga. Brannan's division is sent out eastward, and as part of that, Ferdinand Vanderveer's brigade is marched eastward as well. Now, their route is going to take them eastward, and if you look at the map, the right-hand map on the page number 3 in your handout, you'll see this, this map. Vanderveer's brigade is going to be up here on the very left end of this line. And they're going to wind up fighting one of the most critical actions of the entire battle. As the action began that morning with Cruxton's brigade and some of Forrest's cavalry, just on the very eastern edge of this map, Vanderveer's men, having marched out on this road, will deploy. The 2nd Minnesota on the left front of Vanderveer's brigade. They'll hear the action to their right front. And as they advanced eastward, they'll come in contact with first some of Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry, but then Confederate infantry of Matthew Ector's brigade. And in the woods along the Reeds Bridge Road, and just to the south of it, there will be a growing engagement between that dismounted Confederate cavalry and Ector's mixed brigade of Confederates. Joined by some of John Connell's men of the 1st Brigade of Brannan's division, Ferdinand Vanderveer will hold this position and repulse the Confederate attack in this area initially. They will be aided by the arrival of the next Union division, Absalom Baird's division, arriving from the west, and Ector will be forced to withdraw. But as additional Confederates arrive, Baird's men will be routed. Over the top of Vanderveer's, the men of the 2nd Minnesota will have to actually withhold their fire at one point as fleeing Federals from the regular brigade are driven back over top of them. But once the withdrawing regulars have passed through their line, the men of Vanderveer's brigade will enter the fight once again and help stop the new Confederate force that has arrived on the field. But with the disappearance of those Confederates, Ferdinand Vanderveer noticed something. That during this time, additional Confederate forces had been crossing the Reeds Bridge Road to the north. Some of them had been observed doing so down the corridor of the road. The 2nd Minnesota's right companies had actually been folded back to allow more space for Frank Smith's Battery I 4th U.S. Artillery to fire canister and spherical case down the road against those Confederates. But with the realization that Confederates were crossing the road towards their left, Ferdinand Vanderveer quickly reoriented his brigade to face to the north or northeast and confront the arriving Confederates from that direction. And this move by Vanderveer will be critical in helping to maintain that left flank. The men of the 2nd Minnesota firing from the right of this newly oriented line actually have an enfilade fire on the left of Debrell's attacking Confederate dismounted cavalry. And that enfilade fire will help repulse Debrell's brigade and preserve the Union left flank. On this morning of September the 19th, there is still a space of almost 10 miles between the Union Army and Chattanooga, which if the Confederates had found the left flank and clearly understood its position, could have resulted in a disaster if Bragg had been able to bring to bear sufficient force in this area. But the hard fighting of Vanderveer's brigade and the 2nd Minnesota will keep that left flank protected and convince the Confederates that there is a sizable Federal force in the area. With the withdrawal of Debrell's brigade, badly battered from the encounter with Vanderveer here, the fighting in this area will die down. It will allow the men of the 2nd Minnesota to gather their dead, 8 at this point, to actually begin to get them interred on the battlefield. Their wounded from the engagements here can be carried back to the field hospitals off the edge of the map in this direction. At one point during this fighting, some of the wounded of the 2nd Minnesota actually wound up between the lines. In the initial fight, when Vanderveer's men were facing off to the southeast, the assistant surgeon of the 2nd Minnesota had taken advantage of a low crest or rise of ground and had actually moved the wounded back behind the initial line. But when Vanderveer had to reorient, guess what wound up in front of the new line of the 2nd Minnesota? This cluster of wounded men. Some of them will be struck in the subsequent fighting a second time, but most simply hugged the ground as the battle roared over their heads for a few minutes, and then the Confederates disappeared. The wounded are gathered up and moved off to the field hospital. Late in the afternoon, Vanderveer's brigade will be sent further south to deal with another threat down the line, but will not be further engaged that evening. Overnight, or there's the monument to the 2nd Minnesota for this part of their action on the battlefield. The fighting during the course of the day will flow on southward. This map is not in your handout. And down towards the south end of the line, in fighting in late afternoon in the area of the Vineyard Family Farm, the 2nd Minnesota Light Artillery will be engaged against Confederates at that point. The fighting there will flow back and forth across the large vineyard field for a time, and the 2nd Minnesota Battery will have to displace at one point as the Confederates advanced. Overnight, there's the monument to the 2nd Minnesota Light Artillery in the vineyard field. Overnight, Rosecrans will reposition his troops along the corridor of the Lafayette Road. Brannan's division is put on the line just south of the Kelly Field position, which is marked by the curve or semicircular portion of the Union line here, and Vanderveer's brigade is held in reserve. The morning of September the 20th dawns initially clear, but with the cold temperature overnight, a ground fog rises. And shortly after daylight, suddenly visibility diminished. The men of Vanderveer's brigade had spent a cold night without fires because of the proximity of the Confederates, but now, a little after dawn with the fog, they are able to light fires for a short time, warm a cup of coffee, and then they are going to be moved up into a reserve position immediately behind Connell's and Cruxton's brigades, the other part of of Brannan's division. The Confederate attack is delayed that morning and does not come until 9:30 a.m., but when it did, that attack actually will threaten the very left end of the Union line, something that Rosecrans had been afraid of. But Union commanders along the line know the importance of that left, and troops in reserve are going to be moved in that direction. And that includes Vanderveer's brigade. They are shifted northward and into the Kelly Field, initially facing to the east. When they realize the threat is coming from the north, they will reorient to face to the north. And as they move up to try to figure out exactly the orientation of the attacking Confederates, they are laid down in the northern end of the Kelly Field. During this time, most of the officers of the brigade will lose their horses. Judson Bishop's horse will be struck, and as the horse stumbled and goes down, Bishop is thrown from the horse over his horse's head. Amazingly, the horse will survive and be recovered late in the battle. But Bishop will join most of the rest of the officers of the brigade now on foot, and as the Confederates appear at the northern end of the Kelly Field, the command "Rise Up" is given, and the men of the 87th Indiana and the 2nd Minnesota stand up out of the grass in the north end of the field and deliver a volley into the Confederates of the 47th Georgia and 60th North Carolina at extremely short range. The Confederates withdraw into the cover of the woods. The men of the 87th and 87th Indiana and 2nd Minnesota move up to within about 20 yards of the edge of the woods, and for 20 minutes' time, there is a firefight at the edge of the woods. Both sides trading volley after volley with their enemy at just about 40 to 50 yards distance. The Confederates will soon expend their strength, and the arrival of additional Federals, particularly to the west of the Lafayette Road, will allow a counterattack. and Ferdinand Vanderveer will order the 35th Ohio and 9th Ohio to attack through and over the 87th Indiana and 2nd Minnesota and against the now withdrawing Confederates. Men of the 87th and 2nd Minnesota cannot resist the temptation to join in that forward advance, and they will drive the Confederates back and around that left flank. And the Union left flank is protected again, yet again, by Vanderveer's brigade, including the 2nd Minnesota. There's the move up and then the counterattack. The Vanderveer's brigade will be recalled. Here's the monument to the 2nd Minnesota in the north end of the Kelly Field. Vanderveer's brigade will be recalled and reorganized, and when it is realized that the Union line has collapsed further to the south as a result of a gap inadvertently opened in the Union line by a Rosecrans, or by an order from Rosecrans, Vanderveer's brigade is sent to the sound of the guns off to the west or behind the Kelly Field position. And they'll wind up forming part of the troops that rally on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge under George Thomas. And they'll be within the line, the blue block right here being for the 2nd Minnesota, and throughout the afternoon they will repulse one Confederate attack after another up the slopes, the steep slopes of Snodgrass Hill. In late afternoon, George Thomas will begin a phased withdrawal from the battlefield, dropping back first Stedman's 2 brigades of the Reserve Corps to a blocking position, and then beginning to withdraw first one brigade and then another from both the Kelly Field position and the remaining Snodgrass Hill position, and passing them off to the northwest towards McFarland Gap and Missionary Ridge. Amongst the very last of the men to leave the battlefield are men of the 2nd Minnesota and Ferdinand Vanderveer's brigade, not leaving until after dark and being amongst the last to fire a shot in the battle, and for some of the men, literally the last shot in their cartridge box, having expended all of the available ammunition. The withdrawal will be completed right at dark when the Confederates move up and occupy the positions. And even though the Union Army has had to withdraw, they've withdrawn back towards Chattanooga. They'll complete that withdrawal march that evening, the sound of Confederate cheers echoing in the distance. But while they know they've been forced to give up this field of battle, they are cognizant of the fact that they still possess the landmark of this campaign, Chattanooga. And though forced to abandon this position, they are not yet defeated, and they are ready for what the Confederates might bring on. The stand of the 2nd Minnesota on Snodgrass Hill is commemorated by the most grand of the 3 monuments on the Chickamauga battlefield to that regiment. This one with the bronze group on the top of it. Primarily helping to protect the Union left on both September the 19th and 20th. Particularly the 2nd Minnesota played an important role in helping the Union force at Chattanooga, at Chickamauga, not suffer as serious a defeat as might have otherwise been the case. And they'll be proud of their role as evidenced by the 3 monuments on the battlefield erected to the 2nd Minnesota. They'll, of course, go on and participate in the battles for Chattanooga, culminating in their assault in the Battle of Missionary Ridge, commemorated by that wonderful painting in the state capitol that is reproduced on the cover of your program today. Well, I appreciate you having me here, and I'll be around to answer questions at lunchtime. And so, okay, Steve.